Welcome back to another episode of Crime Scene X. In today's episode, we will be covering 3 scary true neighbor horror stories. Sit back and enjoy. I always prided myself on being rational. Ghost stories, tall tales, and superstitions never scared me. But when I moved into the old Victorian building at the end of Blackwood Lane, I stumbled upon a mystery that defied reason and sent chills down the very marrow of my bones. My new apartment was a bargain, spacious, charmingly vintage, and filled with sunlight. It was perfect for a freelance journalist like me. The neighbors were pleasant and kept to themselves, all except for one, the man in apartment 3B. Mr. Horace, as he introduced himself, was an odd figure. Tall and skeletal, his movements were robotic, and his eyes, a pale icy blue, seemed to lack any warmth or emotion. His smile was nothing more than a thin line, a mimicry of human interaction. We'd exchanged terse greetings in the hallway, but that's where our interaction ended. It wasn't long before I started hearing unsettling noises from his apartment late at night. Scratching, pounding, and occasional cries that sounded almost human. My initial dismissals soon gave way to sleepless nights. One evening, I ran into Mrs. Caldwell from 2A, a kindly old woman who'd lived in the building for decades. Over a cup of tea, I casually mentioned the noises. Her face turned ghostly white, and she whispered that I wasn't the first to hear them. Years ago, a young woman had lived in my apartment. She'd complained about the same noises, about feeling watched. She'd gone missing, never to be found. I shuddered at the story, but still couldn't bring myself to believe in something supernatural. It was curiosity more than fear that drove me to investigate. I started observing Mr. Horace, noting his odd hours, his frequent deliveries of large, unmarked boxes, his secretive glances. My journalistic instincts took over, and I decided to sneak into his apartment. One night, when I was sure he was out, I picked his lock, trembling with anticipation and dread. What I found inside was a world of horrors I could never have imagined. The apartment was a maze of machinery and scientific apparatus. Papers filled with anatomical sketches and mathematical equations littered the place. But it was the hidden room that revealed the true horror. Photographs lined the walls, each displaying different people from the neighborhood, marked with measurements and notations. Among them, I found my face, studied and analyzed, as if I were a lab specimen. In the center of the room lay a surgical table, surrounded by wicked-looking instruments. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. Mr. Horace wasn't just observing, he was experimenting. On people, on us. I stumbled out of the apartment, heart pounding, and locked myself in my home, unsure of what to do. I considered moving, reporting him, but the evidence was all circumstantial, and the fear of what he might do if cornered kept me paralyzed. The noises continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. A constant reminder of the nightmare living next door. The terror became my constant companion, gnawing at me, knowing that I was part of some twisted experiment, knowing that he knew that I knew. Then one day, Mr. Horace disappeared. His apartment was cleared, and a new neighbor moved in. The noises stopped, but the fear never did. Because among his things that were thrown away, I found a journal filled with years of observations, plans, and theories. Mr. Horace is still out there, studying, experimenting, dissecting, and I know that somewhere in the dark corners of the city, the sounds continue, and the terror lives on. The small cul-de-sac on Pine Ridge Road was my childhood home. Everyone knew everyone. Block parties were frequent, and neighbors were like family. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and children played freely on the street. When the Harrisons moved into the vacant house at the end of the road, no one thought twice about it. They seemed normal enough. Jake Harrison, a middle-aged man, lived with his elderly mother. He was quiet, kept to himself, but always offered a wave or a smile. Over time, though, I began to notice something unsettling. Jake's mother, Mrs. Harrison, never left the house. At first, I assumed it was due to her age and health, but as months went by, I never saw her, not even through a window. I started paying more attention to Jake. He was fastidious in his routine, leaving for work at the same time every day, maintaining his lawn with meticulous care, and always keeping the curtains drawn. One summer, my curiosity got the better of me. My friends and I were playing near Jake's house, and I noticed the garage door slightly ajar. The temptation was too great to resist. I slipped inside and found myself in a room filled with an orderly array of tools, chemicals, and gardening equipment. It was all perfectly normal, except for one thing: a heavy padlocked freezer in the corner. Something about it drew me in. A cold chill ran down my spine as I approached it. I knew I was trespassing, but I had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, I picked the lock and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, I found neatly packed containers, each one meticulously labeled. My breath caught in my throat as I read the labels: fingers, eyes, tongue. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled out of the garage, my mind reeling from what I had seen. I told my parents, and they called the police. The subsequent investigation revealed a horror that sent shockwaves through our tight-knit community. Mrs. Harrison had died years ago. Jake had been living with her corpse, preserving parts of her in that freezer. He had been visiting her room every night, talking to her as if she were still alive. The reality of the situation was more terrifying than any ghost story or monster tale. The image of that freezer, those containers, haunted my dreams for years. Our community was never the same after that. The innocence was gone, replaced by a lingering fear of what might be hidden behind closed doors. Jake was taken away, and the house on Pine Ridge Road stood empty, a dark reminder of the horror that had once lived among us. The true terror was not in the gruesome discovery, but in the realization that madness and obsession could exist in the most ordinary of places, hidden behind the facade of normality, waiting to be uncovered. The man who had seemed so ordinary, so mundane, had harbored a darkness that was all too real and all too human, and it had lived right next door. I had always dreamed of living in the peaceful town of San Marino, with its picturesque streets, friendly community, and the promise of a quiet life. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. When I moved into the house on Luna Street, I was welcomed with open arms by my neighbors, all except for the residents of the house next door. The house was large and well-maintained, but its occupants kept to themselves. High walls obscured the view, and security cameras were strategically positioned. Vehicles with tinted windows came and went at all hours. At first, I dismissed it as the quirks of wealthy private neighbors, but over time the pieces began to fall into place, revealing a horrifying picture. Late-night conversations, muffled screams, the faint smell of chemicals, it all pointed to something sinister happening behind those walls. I started to dig deeper, researching the town's history and the people living next door. The house was owned by a shell corporation linked to a notorious drug cartel. San Marino's peaceful exterior hid a dark underbelly, with rumors of corruption reaching to the highest levels of local government. I couldn't ignore what I had discovered. I documented everything I saw and heard, building a case to take to the authorities. But the more I watched, the more terrified I became. I saw men dragged into the house, never to be seen again. I heard cries for mercy that were abruptly silenced. I realized that the occupants of that house were not just drug dealers, they were murderers, and they were operating right next door. The sleepless nights took their toll, and my once safe haven became a place of fear and paranoia. I knew I had to act, but I also knew the risks. I finally took my evidence to a contact in federal law enforcement, someone I trusted and believed to be untainted by corruption. The waiting was agonizing. Every glance from a neighbor, every unexpected noise sent me into a panic. I knew that if the cartel discovered what I had done, the consequences would be deadly. After what felt like an eternity, the day finally came. Federal agents stormed the house next door, arresting its occupants and uncovering the full extent of the horror within. The house was a center for drug manufacturing, torture, and execution. The men I had seen dragged inside had met unimaginable ends. The smell of chemicals had been the scent of death. The news rocked San Marino, shattering its image of tranquility and exposing the darkness that had been lurking just beneath the surface. The cartel's local operation was dismantled, but I knew that the fight was far from over. I was relocated, given a new identity, and forced to leave behind everything I had known. I had escaped the horror next door, but the scars remained. I had lived beside monsters, seen their true faces, and survived. But the knowledge of what they were capable of, the images of what had been happening just a wall away, remained etched in my memory. The house on Luna Street stood empty, a grim monument to the terror that had unfolded within. A house of horrors hidden in plain sight, a nightmare that had been all too real, all too close. The battle against the cartel had been won, but the war was far from over, and the price of uncovering the truth had been my innocence, my peace, and my belief in the safety of ordinary places. Thanks for watching.